April 15th, 1943. 25,000 feet above the Belgian coast, Oberleutnant Hermann Keller of Jagdgeschwader 26 scanned the western horizon. What he saw that morning would alter the Luftwaffe's perception of the American air war forever. Against the sun, vast single-engine silhouettes emerged, climbing with confidence at an altitude German pilots believed was impossible for American fighters. Their wings were broad, their fuselages bulky, their presence strange and unsettling. Keller squinted. No recognition chart in his cockpit showed anything resembling these machines. He steadied his aircraft. Then, without warning, the lead American fighter erupted in light. But it wasn't fire consuming the machine. It was firepower. 8 blazing muzzles unleashed a storm of converging tracers, not in scattered bursts, but in a steady, continuous stream that seemed impossible to evade. His wingman's Focke-Wulf 190 was hit in a fraction of a second, pounded by nearly 40 rounds before Keller could even react. The German aircraft didn't burst into flames, nor did it spiral down dramatically. It simply disintegrated, reduced to fragments of aluminum fluttering into the sky. Keller's combat report, preserved in the Bundesarchive, marked the first recorded encounter with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in combat. What he had witnessed was the debut of a new philosophy in air warfare. The Americans had arrived not with refinement, but with abundance. The Luftwaffe entered the war confident in its design philosophy. The 20mm MG-151-20 cannon, firing explosive shells, was the ultimate answer to the challenges of aerial combat. Pilots were trained to shoot with precision, to master deflection angles, to conserve ammunition until the perfect moment. One well-placed shell could rip through an enemy bomber or sever the wing of a fighter. German aces prided themselves on surgical efficiency. Skill was everything. Ammunition was precious. Firepower was about accuracy, not waste. The Thunderbolt shattered that worldview. It carried 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, each firing at 800 rounds per minute. Together, they produced a wall of fire exceeding 100 bullets every second. With 350 rounds per gun, the aircraft could sustain nearly 33 seconds of continuous fire, an eternity in aerial combat. At convergence ranges of 200 to 300 yards, those 8 streams created a rectangle of destruction no aircraft could survive. To German eyes, it seemed crude. To the Americans, it was industrial certainty. Instead of betting victory on the sharp eye and steady hand of a pilot, the Thunderbolt guaranteed destruction by overwhelming firepower. Colonel Robert S. Johnson, who scored 27 victories in a P-47, explained it simply. We weren't trying to place surgical shots. We were delivering overwhelming firepower. Every trigger pull guaranteed results. Mathematically, the contrast was devastating. A single Thunderbolt carried 2,800 rounds of heavy ammunition, each weighing 1.71 ounces. In a 15-second burst, it could fire more than 2,600 rounds, nearly 171 pounds of metal and incendiary compound hurled into the sky. A Bf-109G, in contrast, carried just 150 rounds for its 20mm cannon and 300 for its machine guns. German fighters could fire for perhaps 6 or 7 seconds before running dry. The Jug could fire repeatedly, through multiple encounters, never worrying about conservation. This difference in philosophy carried into production. In March 1943, the 4th Fighter Group flew Thunderbolts over France for the first time, but radio failures ended the mission without combat. The Germans missed their first chance to meet this new threat. By summer, they had no such luxury. The P-47 had been designed specifically for high-altitude performance, where German engines faltered. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP radial engine with turbo supercharger maintained over 2,300 horsepower above 25,000 feet. There, B-17 bombers flew in tight formations, and there, the Thunderbolt waited. German doctrine emphasized combat below 20,000 feet. The Daimler-Benz engines of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 struggled in thinner air. Even with methanol water injection, power faded at extreme heights. The Focke-Wulf 190A, brutal at medium altitude, grew sluggish above 22,000 feet. Major Egon Meyer admitted in his tactical assessment, above 7,500 meters, the advantage shifts completely to the Thunderbolts. They maneuver freely while we struggle with frozen controls. They attack from above with impunity, deliver their terrible firepower, and climb back to safety. Meanwhile, American factories were achieving miracles of production. Republic Aviation, once a small company, grew into a giant. By 1944, the Farmingdale and Evansville plants together produced nearly 840 Thunderbolts per month, about 28 every single day. Evansville alone eventually built over 6,200. At peak, one American company matched nearly half of Germany's entire fighter production. Joseph Priller of JG-26 initially dismissed intelligence reports of this scale as defeatist propaganda. But after repeated encounters with ever-growing Thunderbolt formations, he admitted in private notes, "If anything, these numbers are conservative. We face industrial warfare on a scale unimaginable. Each Thunderbolt required over 17,000 parts, 305,000 rivets, and engines so complex they embodied the industrial might of the United States. The cost of its 8 guns alone exceeded that of some entire German fighters. Yet America produced over 15,000 of these machines." The clash came to full light on August 17, 1943, the first Great Schweinfurt raid. German fighters surged to meet B-17s, expecting the usual range-limited escorts to turn back. Instead, 240 P-47s pressed forward, their belly tanks granting deep penetration range. When the Luftwaffe dove, they found themselves not against helpless bombers, but against Thunderbolts, spitting torrents of tracers. German pilots wrote of watching comrades vanish instantly, shredded into clouds of debris with no chance for bailout. Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland admitted, "The Thunderbolt's guns don't merely damage, they disintegrate." The psychological impact was swift. Carefully crafted Luftwaffe tactics, honed in duels against Spitfires and Yaks, seemed useless. Instead of maneuvering for perfect shots, Thunderbolts simply pointed and erased targets. Jug pilots perfected new tactics. The high-altitude bounce became their trademark, diving from 30,000 feet at speeds nearing 500 map, firing devastating bursts, then zooming back to safety. German fighters tried to dive away, but the heavy Thunderbolt outpaced them, gaining speed faster than Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs could match. Weight became a weapon. At nearly 14,000 pounds, the Jug accelerated downhill like a hammer dropped from the heavens. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned, if a Thunderbolt was above you, you had little chance to escape. They called such attacks death from above, and still the ammunition disparity haunted them. American pilots fired with confidence, using bursts to adjust aim, engaging multiple targets per sortie. Germans, with precious few shells, hesitated constantly. Every missed burst was a disaster. Every trigger pull was anxiety. The contrast bled into psychology. Americans fought with abundance. Germans fought with scarcity. Factories in Missouri at the Lake City Ordnance Plant produced 6.5 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the war. That alone could supply every Thunderbolt ever built with more than 400,000 rounds, over 140 complete loads per aircraft. German pilots often flew with half loads. By the summer of 1944, as Allied armies surged into France, the imbalance was complete. D-Day saw over 2,000 P-47 sorties by the 9th Air Force. The Luftwaffe could muster only 319 over Normandy. Odds of 20-1 crushed German pilots before they could even fight. The Jug showed its other face that day, the ground attacker. 8 guns, once shredding fighters, now tore into vehicles, trains, and columns of men. One pass could annihilate an entire convoy. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds smashed engines, ignited fuel, shredded crews. Veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by Soviet battle, broke in panic under Jug strafing runs. The roar of the Thunderbolt's engine and the staccato of its guns became a sound of inescapable death. By late 1944, Luftwaffe collapse accelerated. New pilots, arriving with fewer than 10 hours in fighters, were fed into meat grinders. Veteran instructors wept as entire classes perished in their first encounters. Survival rates dropped below 10% against P-47s. Luftwaffe medical officers reported Thunderbolt, neurosis, stress responses to the sound of synchronized machine gun fire. Encounters became massacres. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945. The Luftwaffe launched its last desperate gamble. Hundreds of fighters swept low over Allied airfields, catching aircraft on the ground in surprise strafing runs. For a moment, it seemed a return to the glory days of lightning German attacks. Hangars burned, rows of parked aircraft erupted, and Allied units reeled. But retreat was inevitable, and the trap was waiting. As German squadrons turned for home, fuel running low, ammunition gone, they met scrambling Thunderbolts climbing from rear airfields. Fresh, full of ammunition, and with altitude advantage, the jugs fell upon the retreating formations. The massacre was swift and merciless. The 365th Fighter Group intercepted multiple Luftwaffe units and tore them apart. Within hours, 271 German aircraft were destroyed. 143 experienced pilots never returned. The Luftwaffe had gambled its last and lost. American losses in the air? Just 16. The exchange ratio was unprecedented, an emblem of the air war's brutal imbalance. Even Germany's miracle jet, the Me-262, failed to tip the scales. Yes, it was fast. Yes, it could outrun the Jug in level flight, but jets required long, vulnerable takeoffs and landings. Thunderbolt pilots quickly adapted. They lingered near German airfields, swooping on Me-262s as they struggled into the air or slowed to land. The 8 Brownings did the rest. A jet, no matter how advanced, was still flesh and steel against a wall of fire. The war's arithmetic was against Germany from the start, but the Thunderbolt magnified the disparity. Republic Aviation built 15,686 jugs by war's end. That required more than 125,000 Browning machine guns and billions of rounds of ammunition. The United States manufactured over 12 billion 50-caliber rounds in total, enough to supply its air forces with inexhaustible firepower. Against this, Germany produced just 33,000 fighters of all types over 6 years. By late 1944, fuel shortages crippled even those numbers. Pilots flew with partial loads, or not at all. Training collapsed from 250 hours pre-war to less than 50. Some cadets entered combat with barely 10 hours behind the stick of a fighter. Many fired their guns for the first time not in training, but in battle. And what awaited them was the Jug, piloted by Americans with over 200 hours in type, equipped with computing gun sights that automatically calculated deflection. 8 guns, guided by technology, manned by confidence, bursting with ammunition. Combat was no longer a duel. It was an execution. The psychological toll ran deep. Luftwaffe veterans described Thunderbolt neurosis: sweat, tremors, uncontrollable panic triggered by the sound of synchronized heavy machine gun fire. Survivors admitted that every engagement was haunted by the knowledge that the Jug could fire longer, harder, and faster than they could ever answer. Galland himself confessed that the Thunderbolt didn't just destroy aircraft, it destroyed the Luftwaffe's philosophy. D-Day had already shown the Jug's other power, ground attack. In Normandy, P-47s flew over 2,000 sorties in a single day, reducing German logistics to chaos. By the time Allied troops pushed inland, German supply convoys had learned to fear every open road. Jugs destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 motor vehicles, and more than 6,000 armored vehicles by war's end. German troops called it the Butcher. To them, the scream of its engine overhead meant annihilation. Convoys were left smoking wrecks stretching for miles. Locomotives blasted by 50-caliber fire burst into boilers of steam. Even tanks, thought to be secure, fell victim to concentrated strafing passes that disabled tracks, penetrated engines, and left them burning in fields. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished. Its last pilots, young men barely trained, died in droves. Survival beyond 5 missions was rare. Against Thunderbolts, it was nearly impossible. Veteran instructors admitted that entire classes were annihilated in their first weeks. The final statistics told the story. In Europe, P-47s claimed 3,752 aerial victories. They destroyed tens of thousands of vehicles, thousands of locomotives, and inflicted more damage on German logistics than any other fighter. Losses were 3,499 to all causes, of which only 1,020 fell to enemy fighters. The exchange ratio in the air exceeded 4 to 1. But numbers alone cannot tell the whole tale. The Jug represented something greater. It was the embodiment of American war philosophy: abundance, industry, overwhelming force. Where Germany pursued precision and efficiency, America wielded excess as a weapon. Every burst of 50 caliber fire was not just destruction, but a message. We can afford to waste more than you can afford to lose. Historians like Williamson Murray summarized it. The P-47's 8 guns democratized air combat. Skill became secondary to firepower sustained by industry. German aces with hundreds of kills found themselves equal to American novices when facing walls of 50 caliber fire. After the war, even hardened veterans admitted the lesson. Galland wrote that the Thunderbolt showed America would win through excess. Gunther Rahl, shot down and wounded by a P-47 in 1944, admitted, "We learned to respect not just the aircraft, but the firepower philosophy it represented." Steinhoff carried that memory into NATO, teaching that modern war would always be about production, not individual skill. The Luftwaffe had believed in knights of the air. The Jug proved the age of knights was over. The P-47 evolved to the end. The P-47M reached speeds over 470 mph, among the fastest piston-engine fighters ever built. The P-47N stretched its wings for the Pacific, escorting bombers on 1,000-mile missions. New gun sights made even novices deadly. The Jug was the final word in piston-powered brute force, but beyond technology, its true impact was psychological. The Luftwaffe entered the war believing machine guns were obsolete, that cannons were the only future. They ended it shattered by a machine gun battery so overwhelming it erased their doctrine. German pilots began the war as dueling artists. They ended it as survivors, desperate only to return alive. On the ground, its effect was equally decisive. Troops who once held their lines with confidence broke in terror under strafing runs. Columns disappeared in flame and smoke. Locomotives and supply lines became nothing but wreckage. The Jug crushed not only planes, but armies. In the final months, fuel shortages reduced Luftwaffe sorties to minutes. Pilots calculated not combat, but whether they had enough to return. Jug pilots with abundant supplies flew with patience, climbing high, striking when they pleased. Combat was no longer balanced, it was annihilation. The war ended with clarity. Thunderbolts had flown 500,000 sorties. They were credited with thousands of air victories and destruction beyond calculation on the ground. German pilots faced not warriors, but an industrial machine, even after the lessons lingered. In Korea, when German advisors working with NATO watched American F-84 Thunderjets, descendants of the Jug, conduct strafing runs, some veterans froze, trembling. The trauma of the Jug remained, etched into memory, because the Thunderbolt had not merely fought battles. It had rewritten the rules. It proved that wars would not be won by precision or artistry, but by nations that could produce overwhelming firepower in industrial quantities. The Luftwaffe never recovered from that truth. The Jug was not elegant. It was not romantic. But it was decisive. 8 guns, each roaring fire, together declaring the new reality of war. Not knights, not duels, not art, but industry, abundance, overwhelming force, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, hammer of the skies, and executioner of a philosophy.